Closing out our discussion from week one, as we're talking about messianic prophecy and specifically looking at Isaiah and how the Emmanuel passage from Isaiah 7 relates not only to the historical context of its day, but also to Jesus and how we can have a fulfillment, something of a double fulfillment, although it's not quite as simple as that. There's a lot more nuance involved there. Um, First, to look at the historical context of the passage, all of you did a pretty good job of bringing out the Syro-Ephraimite coalition against the southern kingdom of Judah. This was a time of relative weakness for the Assyrian Empire. It had kind of gone into descendancy, and so the nation of Syria or Aram and Ephraim or Israel had seen an opportunity to take some more power in the area and go against Assyria. They wanted Judah to join them. Judah, of course, was in a tight spot because Assyria's ruler, Tiglath-Pileser III, who actually would start the ascendancy again of what would become the Neo-Assyrian Empire, was building strength back up. And of course, the temptation was for Judah to join the Syro-Ephraimite coalition. Of course, when they refused, the Syro-Ephraimite coalition came down and attacked them, and Ahaz had to call TP3, as he's affectionately called, over to help him. And of course, that was a bad move on Ahaz's part because he becomes a vassal king to the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Emmanuel child is set in this background, and this is the sign that God has given that the Syro-Ephraimite coalition will not be a threat to Judah, that God will take care of Judah, and he doesn't need to call the Assyrians for help. And of course, we see in verse 16 of chapter 7, for the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, or for before the boy will know enough to choose the evil and to refuse the evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. Essentially saying, look, the Syro-Ephraimite coalition, Aram, Syria, and Israel are not a big threat to you. This child will be born, and by the time he reaches a certain age, this threat will be gone and taken care of. And we see that within 10 years, 732 is roughly around the time of the Syro-Ephraimite War. 722 is when the northern kingdom of Israel would be no more. So within 10 years, that promise is fulfilled. And so this child was a sign for that. And it's a sign signified by his name, Emmanuel, God with us is God. God is with us. It's the sense that this child who will be born in Isaiah's day will be a sign to the king that says by the time he's old enough, not even by the time he's 10, this threat's going to be gone. So trust God. And you don't need to go and turn towards to Assyria, trust in them. You obviously don't need to fear Aram and Israel. And of course, Ahaz did not obey the sign, and Assyria becomes dominant and dominates Judah for the rest of its history until Assyria falls, and of course the Neo-Babylonian Empire takes over. So that's the immediate context, and you guys did a good job of bringing that out. The question then becomes, how does Jesus fit into this? Because it seems that Isaiah has a specific child and a specific time in mind, and this is how a lot of prophecy works. Prophecy isn't necessarily foretelling, that is, telling the future as much as it's forthtelling. This is a classic saying in that telling the people this is how you need to behave, trying to get an action or belief from the people. And that's what the sign even for, is to get Ahaz to trust God and not call Assyria for help. When we're looking at how then this prophecy is fulfilled by Jesus, what we're not seeing necessarily something that's cut and dry as a one-to-one correspondence where this is promised and this promise is fulfilled in this specific way, this specific time by Jesus. No, it's more in the sense of this promise is it comes at a certain time for a certain place, and in Jesus we see we see elements of that. That's kind of what's going on. It's not that Isaiah is not talking about Jesus. It's that he's talking about a specific child, and when Jesus is born to a virgin, we are to look back at the Emmanuel passage and say, the function that Emmanuel served back then, Jesus serves that same function in a larger way. He was born to a virgin. In the same way the Emmanuel child was born to what could be called a virgin, a young woman, not a virgin then. I don't think that was a virgin birth, but Matthew is saying, but because it could also be a virgin, we see in this virgin birth that Jesus serves the same function as that Emmanuel child. That means he reminds the people who are facing outside threat, this a Roman Empire, that God is still with them, and that they can still trust in Him and not trust in a coalition with another government. This is the Romans, and that God is still with them. And this is a typological fulfillment that is very, very common in how the New Testament treats Old Testament prophecy. And that the New Testament's not saying that the Old Testament was talking exclusively about Jesus. What they're saying is that Jesus fulfills that prophecy in a greater way. The same function that original prophecy served in its original context, oftentimes they see in Jesus a fuller fulfillment, a greater fulfillment, in the sense that it's that same function, but even in a better way. And this is something the book of Hebrews talks about: better, better, better. Jesus is the better everything. So we don't want to just think of it in simplistic terms as simply a one-to-one correlation, or simply just a multiple fulfillment. But it's that by quoting the one verse, the Emmanuel verse, the verse 14, what Matthew is intending his reader to do is pull the entire context, that entire passage, verse chapter 7, even chapter 8, going into chapter 9, that whole passage in, and read Jesus' birth in light of what that passage in chapter 7, 8, and 9 is teaching about a child that does fulfill a promise that God is with the people, and He will be with them, even though there's a very powerful outside nation. It seems that the people are helpless, but the reminder in a child that God is with them. Jesus is that child par excellence. And so when we start looking at it like that, we start understanding that we can still treat the original text, for instance, Isaiah or anywhere else, in its original context without saying that it doesn't apply to Jesus. It's just that it applies to him in maybe a different way than we've considered if we look at it typologically. Now, sometimes passages are clearly about Jesus. If we get to chapter 9, it seems it's very clear. It seems much clearer that this is talking about someone other than the Emmanuel child. There seems to be a shift in what Isaiah is talking about, and that seems to be a clear indication that he's talking about maybe just Jesus and Jesus alone there. Although it's possible he's talking about someone else, and Jesus fulfills that in a second way or something like that. But I tend to read chapter 9 as clearly he's moving beyond looking towards this messianic figure that's going to come in Christ, and that's how we want to look sometimes at Old Testament prophecy, especially Messianic prophecy. It's this idea that it's not necessarily just a one-to-one correlation, but it's much deeper than that. And it's in that we actually get a lot from the text, in that by quoting that one passage, that one verse, we can understand that Matthew's trying to bring the whole passage in. It was a common rabbinic technique of the day, quoting one verse to refer to the whole. Jesus does this on the cross when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He doesn't say anything else, but if the people would understand, and we should understand, that he's meaning to incite that entire psalm. And of course, that psalm talks about his situation a lot. He's saying, look, that situation, what's happening here to me now should be read in the context of it's the same type of situation in a fuller, greater sense.